on?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And we are golden.
Okay.
Fix the framing.
So I guess more people wanted to be online than in person, but that's okay. I was hoping for an intimate experience anyway. Actually, I was hoping to not do it in here. I was hoping to just do it smaller, but this gives us the ability to record it. So that's basically where we're at. But okay, so welcome. This is our parenting class. And we wanted to do a parenting class to get everybody on the same page as to how we do things and to answer questions. And to answer questions and do workshopping. So basically the first part of it is just going over information. I have a slideshow prepared for you. For those online, we can post it, I guess. And then for the second portion, it's if you guys have question and answer as to how we want to do things. So that's basically it. And any questions so far? Nope. I expect this to take about 2 hours, and I hope that it doesn't go longer. We got started a little bit late. But yeah, so to start with, I'm just going to talk about parenting in terms of my experience with it and in terms of why we're going over what we're going over. But before I start talking about that, Pastor Monty is up here on the stage also to help me talk about it because we like to co-parent resources. No, not funny. Okay. So do you want to speak a little bit about your experience with parenting and what we're doing here?
Well, what I thought I'd do is just give, for purposes of the introduction, most of you know that I'm the senior elder emeritus.
That's the term.
I think that's how that falls. Basically speaking, my background, I have tried not to make a big deal of my background, but I've been pastoring for 20 plus years. I've been married for 43 plus years. I have 3 children. Is it 8 or 9 grandchildren now? I'm losing count. It's an age thing. I have 2 bachelors and a master's. And I worked in the real world, if you might call it that, as in non-criminal law enforcement for my last 15 years of my career. And I pastored a church for 20 plus years. So we have lots of experience in dealing with raising children and being successful at it. All of my children are successful as adults, and that is the goal, to create a situation where your children become successful as adults, and you are guiding them through that process. So we'll be talking about how it is that you can accomplish that.
So most people obviously know who I am. I am the current senior pastor of the church, and my experience with parenting is pretty vast. Personally, I have 3 children between the ages of 9 and 0, because I guess they don't count, anything before 1 is, it's all months. So she's like about, 7 months now. And they're all well-adjusted, they have a high emotional quotient, and they are pro-social people, which is the goal that I am always striving for, is pro-social. And we'll talk about what that looks like. In terms of co-parenting and surrogacy, I've been actively co-parenting children for about 20 years in all ranges of age. And I've been the godfather, been asked to be the godfather to over 10 different kids over that time. So my Father's Days are very notably full. I've also been reverse adopted by many into a position of surrogacy. So I've walked down more than a few kiddos, down the aisle, in them wanting me to be the stand-in patriarch in their families. And oftentimes their children get added to my godchildren. In terms of adoption and foster parenting, I have some experience there. I was licensed and certified as a foster parent in the state of Oregon through the longest running care organization for youth here in Oregon, which is Boys and Girls Aid. It actually predated DHS out here. And though I'm no longer in service to their organization because I focused more on ministry and started having my own kids, I was specifically trained during that time to help foster in the area of transitional living for youth who were being moted out of the system and needed basically a real-world launching point as they were leaving the system. So I specialized specifically in helping young women who were in trauma over the age of 17. And I've remained friendly and even influential with them in their lives. And then personally, I've also taken on full-time outside of the system, fostering. So my oldest kiddo is the woman who now teaches our youngest children, Jen. So I raised her between the ages of 10 to where she is now, which is 26. How old is she? 26, 25? I don't know. Yeah, there you go. Standing in for her mother and father while they were out doing what they do. And I'm currently raising my sister-in-law in the same way. At the church, you might not know this, but I'm actually responsible for all the educational programs at the church. So together with Heidi and Shayla, the developmental cadre is actually my brainchild. We created it, we're responsible for running it. Basically everything passes my desk. I'm the elder in charge of its direction. I'm also, with Brittany and Kelsey, the co-founder of our Adolescents program, which is called The Outsiders. I started that, not a part of that, but I still am actively involved in it, kind of behind the scenes. I'm also the director of our mastery program, which is called the Elders Academy, where we teach classes. This is one of those classes. I'm also the co-founder and lead counselor and instructor for the Insight program, which is our counseling program. And in our counseling program, we spend a lot of time dealing with children, and specifically checking in with them, making sure that they're doing well academically and socially and at home and so on and so forth. So I have been essentially plotting the course for education and healthy parenting, both personally and professionally at ABF for the better part of 20 years. If there's a service that you've enjoyed or a professional interaction that you've enjoyed or have come to use, I probably either initiated it or trained the person that you've interacted with. To that end, there have been a few mechanisms that we've put in place over the years to help us with the process of eating and sleeping and breathing, developmental wellness, and this course goes over some of that material. So before we get started to that end, this is just a brief overview of one facet of what we teach to our leadership structure. We have more teachings than this that make up the framework of how we deal with developmental wellness. So that includes a philosophy of parenting, which we call crib theory. There's a philosophy of teaching developmentally, which we call red theory. There's a philosophy of connecting to legacy, which we call ACEs. And the list kind of goes on and on, right? You can find more of that if you want to, because it might get referenced. You can find more of that at our website, abfpdx.org, or you can talk to one of our deacons. Heidi and Kelsey can hook you up with information if you want to kind of do a deeper dive. But like I said, this is just a very short dive into something we call X training. And you'll see it's training session 2. Don't worry, you didn't show up to the wrong class. That's because this is only one module of X training. There's other X trainings. If you're wondering what X is, it's about the mutant power. I'm just kidding. It is... It's about extra biblical. So basically it means stuff that's from outside the Bible that we still teach on. So this is X training, and Module 2 specifically of X training was something that I developed during my time at Boys and Girls Aid. I worked on synthesizing a lot of the information, talking with their trainers, so on and so forth, and they were gracious enough to give me access to some of their training material, and I kind of synthesized my own course that worked with what we do as a church and kind of took from various areas, including, you can kind of see on this side, like Erickson's stages of development, dealing with conventional wisdom, basic childhood development, love and logic, so on and so forth. All of our leadership is required to take X training. All of our leadership is required to take the several modules that are involved in it, and it's a lot longer of a teaching. Today, we're going to breeze through it, just to give you an overview of what it is. Any questions? Nope? Okay, so let's move to the slide. So today's goals are to 1, learn about typical normal human development. Number 2, to learn about the impact of our child abuse and neglect on normal child development. Next is to become more aware of our communication skills, and also to learn about being, well, we might not do that one, a mandated reporter. Like I said, this is normally for our leadership, so this is more about parents. Okay, so let's go on to basic childhood development, and let's talk about attachment, bonding, and Erickson's views. So there's a difference between attachment and bonding, and they're both important. Bonding is psychological, whereas bonding is physiological, whereas attachment is psychological. Bonding happens inside the mother's womb, whereas attachment happens over time, and then bonding is automatic, whereas attachment is fostered and grown by a caring and nurturing person. So we want both of these things to happen. We want attachment and bonding to happen. So for us, there's basically 2 types of things that we're dealing with as parents here. We're dealing with parenting and co-parenting. And so when you're thinking about being a parent, you want to deal with proper bonding, and when you're thinking about dealing with co-parenting, or the people who are helping you raise your children, you want to be thinking about attachment. In both cases, both things are a necessary part of creating a safe structure for our children. I feel like I may have already just jumped into some depth here. Does anybody have any questions at any point? No? Nobody yet? Okay. Let's skip forward to attachment cycles. All right. So, attachment cycles. They start with the concept of need. Let's just reveal the whole picture. Oh, you just press through. There you go. Okay. So, an attachment cycle is basically what proper attachment looks like. And so while we're attaching to people as human beings, this is the process. When a baby first comes out, it bonds automatically. But over time, your responsibility as a parent in becoming the parent is in establishing proper attachment. This is something that co-parents can do, like I said, but it is the responsibility of every person who's taking care of a child to properly establish attachment. And there's three cycles of attachment. One is called trust of care, the next one is called trust of control, and the next one is called trust of self. The very first thing that human beings establish in attachment is called trust of care, and it starts off with need. So essentially, a baby needs something, or a child needs something, right? And so when a baby has a need, what does it do? Cries, right? They go into need expression, which is down below. Now, those of you who are parents know that if you pay attention to your child, you can tell when that baby's going to cry, right? You can tell. You can see it in their face. You can sort of hear the whine start to build. That stage is called tension. So we have need, tension, need expression. The next thing that needs to happen for a proper attachment, which is to go all the way around, is that the parent responds. And when the parent responds with the two things in blue, which is the messaging of, I will meet your needs, I will take care of you, then what happens is something we call empathic attunement, where a baby or a child becomes relaxed. And so, you give to a child to meet their needs. They need breast milk, you give them breast milk. They need to be held. You hold them, they relax. You change their diaper, they relax. This is just basic human development 101, okay? So when you do that, it creates a circle or a cycle of trust. And the more you do it, the more saturation and consistency you have, the more a child learns the messaging that you give them. Because everything that you say to your child is a message. Every action that you make, every idea, everything they watch you, it's a message. So the message you want to give to your child is, again, I will meet your needs, I will take care of you. The more consistency, the more saturation, the child walks away with the message, they will meet my needs, they will take care of me. It is safe for me to be tense. It is safe for me to express my need. It is safe for me to have a parent respond to me, and it's safe for me to relax. Okay? You want to add anything to that? Okay. Any questions so far?
I'm sure you'll touch on this, but with trusted care cycle specifically, is there a stage of development, like 1 to 3, that this is most impactful?
It's all stages of development. This is a message that continues to be needed, and I will touch on it, but to overview you, it's a message that continues to need to be repeated as a person goes through stages of development.
That's why it's so important in 1 to 3 for the child to be with a primary caregiver, because you have the bonding going on at the same time as the attachment.
Yes, yeah, that's a part of it, yeah, for sure. And it's going to be the same across the board at every stage of development, depending on where that child is in life. So 1 to 3, 3 to 6, 6 to 12, 12 to 18, even if they're not even in care, and they're 18 to 25, 25 to 40, so on and so forth. The same attachment cycles are happening. They're just happening with a different level of maturity.
At those ages, though, the bonding doesn't play such a significant role as it does when they're 1 to 3.
Well, it does, but it's a different type of bonding. So it's like a bonding of experience, right? So it's like when you go through like a traumatic experience with somebody at the age of 18, you are much more likely to be bonded to them than, a non-traumatic experience. And that's why you see people connecting that way when they go through trauma. They bond really easily. But then attachment is a completely different thing. But yes, biological, like physiological bonding that is enabled by the mother specifically, especially a mother who isn't taking chemicals or things like that during the birthing process, where the right chemicals in her body and the baby's body are released, that helps the baby to bond in a way that's different. But yeah.
Set a good foundation.
Yeah. 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 All right, so next slide. So the next one is in the attachment cycle is called trust of control. And so basically you kind of graduate from the first one and you're constantly working on this idea in attachment that you are safe, that your caretaker will meet your needs. Then you go into trust of control. And so now you express your need and you've got your tension, right? Except for it's a little bit different. Because of your relaxation, because you feel that you can express yourself, the natural tendency as we develop then is to take action. This is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's part of maturity. So the child takes action. Maybe the child wants that food, sees that food, and then decides to lunge for it, right? That's taking action. What needs to happen at that point is that the parent sets limits. The caretaker sets limits. Now what's going to happen is the child is going to resist that limit, and then the parent has to maintain the limit. When the parent maintains the limit, it actually causes relaxation and empathic attunement again. Now, the reason why we want to maintain limits is because we want our children to understand proper boundaries, because they're operating in a world that has boundaries. They can't lunge for everything that they want, because the reality is, as they get older and older, those things usually belong to someone else, right? And that's going to get them in trouble. Or let's say it doesn't belong to somebody else, and they just satiate their hunger over and over and over again until they become fat, diabetic, and die. Yeah, it's going to happen when they're old people, but still, like, we have to set real boundaries for our children. And so we have to set realistic limits for them. Now, you'll notice that nothing in what I've said implies that you need to be yelling at your children or anything like that. But limits do need to be set. Any questions there? Okay, so before we move on from this slide, the messaging that you need to transition from as a caretaker is no longer, I will meet your needs, I will take care of them. It's not that you don't still have that, but you need to add a message, and the message is, I will keep you safe, and I do know what's best for you. So now you've added a compounding message to it that, you know, builds on top of it. This is what you want your child to walk through. Let's go ahead and move on to the next. You have anything you want to say?
Well, I would just add that this element is constantly in flux. So you constantly have to be applying it, but then you also have to realize that as your child gets older, it's going to vary in how it's applied, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the message still remains the same. So your child is naturally going to challenge you as they get older, and you are naturally going to have to put out this message consistently, even as they challenge you. And oftentimes when parents have problems, it's because they allow this to break down.
Yeah, and we are gonna talk about maladaption, which is when this process breaks down in a little bit. What were you gonna say, Brian?
Can you just briefly talk about when I see parent sets limits, I think of, I was listening, I read a book, I think his name's Douglas Wilson.
Doug Wilson?
Doug Wilson.
Yeah.
Yeah. Particularly, obviously raising young boys, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how, like, with the mother and the father have to play different roles in setting that limits. That's not a great question.
I'm not hearing the question yet.
Yeah, I don't know. When I see parent sets limits, I think, like, for instance, Jess and I, we have, obviously we want to maintain that trust or control. I think something, if I may, like, elaborate, is like being a father, like, I'm going to maybe push and stretch him more than the mother would, right? Or,
Yeah, that's, yes. If I understand what you're getting at, yes, that is going to be a difficulty that parents are going to have to deal with each other, right? Yeah. And the way that you're going to deal with that properly is to pay attention to enabling the proper attachment between the children of the co-parents. And we can talk about what that looks like when we get to workshopping that out. Part of that is going to be good communication. Part of it is going to be understanding this and trying to make the best possible version of it. Then the other part of it is going to be about understanding the needs of the child, understanding where they're at developmentally, and then, sort of mapping everything instead of making reactionary decisions, right? So where everything is hyper communicative. Does that make sense? Yeah. But we can talk about that when we workshop it.
Well, I think what I would add, just to clarify, is so that the concept here is not that you're parenting individually. You don't have two parents that are individually parenting. You have two parents that are, assuming that we're dealing with two parents, you have two parents that are having to communicate with each other and parent as one. So that necessitates the parents sitting down and discussing for the age that the child is, what are the appropriate boundaries, and to agree upon that, and to agree upon how to maintain that trust of control. So it's and again, that's where things break down oftentimes, is parents not communicating and sending mixed messages to a child, and not recognizing that every child is different. So my first child has to have different boundaries than my second child because they're individuals. And so you have an overall understanding of things, but each child has to be treated differently, and the boundaries have to be set between the two of you, and then you have to agree on how it is that's applied. And we're talking work.
Yeah, and specifically, Pastor Monty brings up an important point, which is what we're talking about is a consistency of messaging, right? So the message always has to be the same for the child. You're trying to give a child a consistent message as opposed to give a child silos of messages. What you don't want is for a child to walk away thinking that this is the truth in this world, and this is the truth in this world, and this is the truth in this world, right? You want it to be holistic. And so sometimes, at the risk of making a mixed message or of breaking that holistic chain of messaging, it is important for parents, when you're not risking something that's large, to acquiesce, to allow for a singular message to get across, as long as it's not going to violate the larger message. And that is about applying proper attachment, if you will, to relationship outside of parenting. Because this stuff, if you haven't picked up on it already, is basic developmental human psychology, which means it applies not just to children, which is how we're applying it, but it also applies in relationship with other people. So, but let's save more questions like that for workshop, and we'll keep going. The messaging here that we're trying to accomplish is, I do know what's best for you. This is important, and Pastor Monty alluded to it earlier, because what basically happens is, if we don't draw boundaries properly, then we're giving a different message. All of these good messages have converse messages. In our sort of Americanized way of looking at it, saying that something, giving boundaries to our children seems like a bad thing. It just does. But in truth, what we're telling our children is that the world is not safe. And that they can't trust the structure of things. So because they don't know where they can put their foot down, they have a hard time developing this, which is called trust of control. So what happens in trust of control is that a kiddo has, by the way, kiddo is the universally accepted foster care language for a child. So you'll hear me say it all the time because that's what I picked up in foster care. But when a kiddo has proper attachment in trust of care and trust of control, then they have the opportunity to learn something called trust of self. What that is need turns to tension, tension turns to action, and then basically, instead of applying the limit that you have set, the boundary that you have set for the child extrapolates their own limit based on that, and now they're setting their own limits. When a child, for instance, says, Mom and Dad said don't touch that, that's hot, and then they don't touch it, but Mom and Dad aren't there, that's trust of self. That means that child knows now how to operate in a world without their parents putting fences down, right? Because you've given them safe boundaries. So now they get to extrapolate, they get to apply things, and it's gonna be a sloppy mess. But when they learn that a limit works, they're actually gonna be able to navigate that world. They're going to trust themselves, right? And that's really important for attachment. It's gonna give them a sense of self-satisfaction, a sense of pride, as we call it, and it's going to message themselves. So in the past, we're creating messages for them. Now we want them to understand messages about themselves, which is, I can make good choices. Doing good feels good. Doing bad feels bad, right? And the purpose of that is to give them a healthy understanding by which to navigate the world when, quite frankly, you are not there, right? That then sets them up for relational success, for business success, for all of that. What you don't want is for them to enter into a relationship with somebody, for instance, where they are confused about the messaging and bad things happen and they feel that that is good. And we see that all the time in relationships where you've got, especially like in my experience with foster care, with surrogacy of young ladies, right? Where you see them having bad relationships with their father, and then they go out and they look for things that feel bad because they think this is good. So we want to undo that messaging, and we want to hopefully never establish that messaging. This is the way we do it. They need to be able to properly communicate with themselves. Sort of think of it as sending the right warning signals to the brain, like when they're going through things. Any questions? Okay, so basic attachment reminders. Attachment is a choice. It's a choice that is reinforced by behavior. It's not something that's physiological. You can't help bonding with your parent. You can break the bond to some degree, but you can't, like, you can make the bond unhealthy, but you can't break the bond. That's why so many kids who have bad parents still pursue their parents in some way, shape, or form, whether it's in the form of a lover, whether it's in the form of searching for a parent that abandoned them, so on and so forth. You can't break the bond. You can make it really unhealthy, though. But attachment is a choice, and it can be reinforced by behavior. Attachment is something that's built over time and requires consistency. It requires predictability. Are we not on the same slide? Okay. It requires consistency and predictability. You'll hear me sometimes use other words for this. I constantly say things like consistency and saturation, right? You'll hear me say things like that. That's what's required to build attachment, because we want to use a language that enables the process of attachment, so we have proper messaging so that kids can interact in a healthy and safe way so they can be healthy and safe adults. Here's another thing. Trust of control cannot be established without trust of care. And trust of self cannot be developed without trust of control and trust of care. So in other words, these things are impacted and compounded by each other. If a person doesn't trust themselves, if you are ever interacting with a person who is hyper, or if you yourself are hyper insecure, it means that you don't have trust of self because you didn't have trust of control, probably because you didn't have trust of care. That's what it means. And that's not a negative that's not, there's no guilt in it. It's just the facts. However, like I said, the reverse is true. Because they can be compounded, it means it can be built. So that's what we want to work to do. That's what we work to do in co-parenting and surrogacy, is we try to build those things up in a person even though they haven't been built at the foundation. So attachment and or lack of it impacts basically all aspects of child development, which is why we start there when we talk about it. So let's look at areas of childhood development. So we have the cognitive area, which is intellectual or thinking abilities. We also have the emotional area, which is the affective area or the feelings side of things. We also have the social area, which is the relationships with others or how people play with each other. And then lastly, we have the physical area, which is body changes, maturation, how people grow. When we're looking at childhood development, we want to consider these 4 factors. Okay? When we're talking about the spiritual side encompasses all of these. There is a misunderstanding that spirituality is its own silo, but in actuality, everything is spirituality. So at least in the biblical model, like it's holistically everything is spiritual. God touches all aspects of these things because he created us to grow in all of these ways. So if you're like, why are we having a parenting class in a church, but we're not talking about the theology? Secret, you are talking about the theology. You want to add anything so far?
Were you going to break these down?
I am. Well, yes, I am, but not quite yet.
So again, I'd go back to keeping in mind or remembering that when you're dealing with your children, each child has to be looked at from this standpoint. So you'll find remarkably that your children are different cognitively. They have different emotions. They'll interact with others differently, and their bodies will be different. They look different. They sound different. So each child has to be looked at individually. This forms a framework for you to understand how to approach your child, but there's no cookie cutter child.
Right. Yeah. One good way of looking at these things in terms of your goal is to add, in terms of goals, is to add pro in front of it, right? So pro-social is the term you heard me use earlier. It essentially means a child that wants relationships and wants to be able to play well with others, right? Now you think about society, and so often in society what you see is the opposite. I want to be left alone. I only want one or two friends. I don't want people to bug me. I don't play well with others, so on and so forth. We don't like that. That's not healthy development, right? We want our children to be pro-social. They can have a conversation with anybody. They can make friends in any environment, so on and so forth. Same thing, cognition or cognitive, right? In a lot of cultures, including this one, thinking about things is not something that we put pro in front of, believe it or not. We are a consumer society, and we want people to consume without thinking. We want to bypass the thought process and make it as easy as possible for people to consume information. That's not healthy development. Healthy development is pro-cognitive. We want our children to be thinkers. We want them to process everything. Emotional, affective, or feelings, right? We want our children to be feeling, especially for men these days. Being pro-emotional is unacceptable. It is either unacceptable as men, or the only safe place for a man to be pro-emotional is to strip himself of his gender completely and basically move into the LGBTQ community, which is unfortunate because men should be emotional. And this is just the case in general. We need to be pro-emotional for our children. We want them to have all of the emotions because they're given to us by God. And then lastly, you'll see a good version of this, I don't know if a good, but a good example of this that pops up is pro-sexual, right? Here we're looking at pro-body. We don't want our children to be ashamed of their bodies, and that includes sexuality. We don't want a child to grow up ashamed of the fact that they're sexual beings. What we want is for them to have a real understanding of what being a sexual being looks like. And so this is true both of their body shapes, their sexuality, their skin color, the list goes on and on, right? So think of this in terms of our goal as adding pro in front of it. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay, now let's move on. So there's this guy, his name's Erickson. I'm pretty sure, I can't remember because I built this a long time ago, but I think his first name is Eric. Yes. So his name is Eric Erickson. And he, you can move forward. And he developed a way of thinking about development as developmental stages. Now, I just want to point out to you that these developmental stages are this is one way of looking at how human beings develop. It is a basically accepted way, but it is one way. There's lots of different ways that people look at things. But your terms of like puberty, for instance, basically comes from Erickson. So in terms of this, what you need to understand about attachment is that attachment occurs within developmental stages. So basically, there's 3 cycles of attachment, remember, the trust of care, the trust of control, and then trust of self. And your goal as a parent is to move your child between the 3 stages before they hit, between the 3 cycles before they hit the next stage. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. So these are your basic stages. Now, I will also point out that these stages are actually malleable depending on how society is changing. And the way that a good example of that would be in the adolescent stage. Adolescence, young adulthood, and middle adulthood. Well, really, adolescence and young adulthood, right? So, are you guys aware that adolescence is changing?
No.
Yeah, it's a thing. What is adolescent when I was an adolescent 20 years ago has shifted. And now we have something called late adolescence. And the same thing is true when this was developed in the 1950s, I think, this concept of adolescence, it was the first time where they really started thinking about something called teenagers, right? That didn't exist before because basically you were a child and then you were grown. And part of that has to do with the hardness of life, the way that things worked in an agriculture, like in an agricultural society. And then without going too much into it, there's lots of books you can read on this subject, but because we switched into an industrial society, the way that we worked changed, and so then it created a class of young adults who couldn't quite work and couldn't quite be adults. And so that kind of shifted how things work. And we've kind of been that way ever since then, and it gets pushed later and later. Now, in our Outsiders ministry, we define adolescence as actually being between the ages of 13 to 25. I actually believe that it's longer than that, probably all the way to 30. But it shifts depending on how culture is. So this model is already outdated. That's the point I'm making to you. This model is already outdated, but it will show you how we're going to operate. It'll kind of give you what we need. And some of the things are just kind of have been true. Like I said, in adolescence, there's growing room. So basically, you have the stage on the one side, and these are like how we define them. Then you've got the ages, and then you have what we call an ego crisis. So an ego crisis is what the person is working through in terms of their inner self, in terms of their inner dialogue when they're thinking and having a conversation with themselves. This is what they're trying to define. So we'll just take the ego crisis in stages 0 to 1. So that ego crisis is a simple question of trust versus mistrust. What this is saying is that, what Erickson is saying is that when your child is born all the way to when they're about 1, they're trying to define one simple message. Can I trust things? And so they can either walk away with the idea that the world is something they can trust, or they'll walk away with the idea that the world is something they cannot trust. So we go back to trust cycles and we think that through, and we think about the messaging that we're trying to give. Everything is angled toward trusting, right? If you don't do that properly, then the converse message comes out. I cannot trust. You do not care for me. You do not meet my needs. You do not know what's best for me. You do not, I cannot trust myself. I cannot trust others. Like, this is the converse messaging that happens when a person doesn't go through trust cycles properly at 0 to 1. What's going to happen is they're going to go through certain events. Again, some of these events aren't necessarily true, like feeding, toilet training. Those things are pretty good, but like school, people have different life, you know. So it could be, you could put something on there like tying their own shoes. Like there's different events that are important that aren't necessarily listed here, is the point I'm making. And it will depend on your culture. Maybe you're in a culture that doesn't have shoelaces. So you have to sort of look for events, and you can even manufacture those events. For instance, in the Greek cultures, some of the Greek cultures, like the Spartan culture, what's the thing they did, Colin? Hunting wolves? Yeah.
Rites of passage.
You're coming of age.
Yeah, rites of passage, right? Those aren't innate, but they're innate to the culture, okay? So you can manufacture things to provide a sense of developmental success, if you want to. What is supposed to happen during those times is your ego strengths. So essentially, that a person walks away, they have learned that they can trust, they complete their event, and now they've got a strength that gets put into their bank of personhood. So in other words, my world is innately hopeful if I walk away with a sense of trust and I accomplish the things that I need to accomplish. That's what we're looking for. We're looking to bank all of these things. So you can go down the list and you can see shame and doubt between 1 and 3. One of the main events they talk about is toilet training, and it has will on there as an ego strength. What it means by will is essentially a sense of initiative. And you'll see that later on when 3 and 6, right, is the term initiative versus guilt. So I'll just run through these really quick and kind of teach you how to decode what it's saying. But essentially, in terms of the ego crisis, you have trust versus mistrust, which I covered. You have autonomy versus shame and doubt. This is sort of the age when they start to realize that something called object permanence. Have you guys heard of that? So basically, babies. Okay, you ever played peekaboo with a baby? Why do you think that game is fun to them? Because it's a magic trick. That's why it's fun. Okay? A baby doesn't understand that things stick around. They don't understand the idea of time and space the way that we do. In fact, even as a kid, when you hear a child talk about like, oh, this thing took so much time, blah, 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 and you're like, you don't even know what that means, right? Because as you get older and older, you understand time and space better. Well, children don't understand object permanence at a very young age. So when you play peekaboo with them, literally what you're doing is a magic trick. You are making yourself disappear and then reappear over and over and over. Like to them, you poofed out of existence. And that's going to make them feel scared if you do it for a long period of time, right? But if you poof out of existence and then poof back into existence, they're like, well, how did that happen? And they start laughing, right? That's what that is. Peekaboo is a magic trick. So, where was I going with that? So this is the time when they're experiencing something called object permanence. They're developing it, and they're going to start understanding how the world works, and they're going to start understanding their own ability to grab at things and to move around and so on and so forth. If you don't allow your child to do that, then they're going to feel bad about doing that. They're going to feel like they can't do things on their own. They can't, it's not okay for them to move, to touch things, to taste things, because they're largely using their mouth at this point, And so then they're going to develop a sense of shame about that. So what you want is for them to develop this sense of will, that it is okay for them to take initiative. It is okay for them to want things. So the next thing is initiative versus guilt. That will translates into them making efforts on their own versus feeling bad about wanting things. So basically, when they deal with that, they're on their way to developing independence. A child that cannot operate on its own, that doesn't feel fine to sit down and play by itself, is a child that has issues with development in the 2 stages before this. So what you want is for them to get lost in what they're doing. You want them to start playing with blocks, and now they're building, and and they get lost in it, and that develops something we call imaginative play. It allows a child to essentially what they're doing is they're constructing an internal dialogue, but they're telling stories to themselves, they're making up imaginary friends, they're like doing all of these things, sort of developing who they are as a person. And they can start working on things, building like projects in their head, building houses with blocks and playing with Legos and stuff like that. That creates for them a sense of purpose. They can become goal-oriented. So now we get from 6 to puberty, and we deal with this thing called industry versus inferiority, which basically takes that one step further and says, I can turn the things that I want to do into mechanisms so that I can survive. If I do this, then I can do this. Those of you who have little boys or have been around little boys will start to see your kids saying, I can build this weapon.
Amen. Oh.
Get ready for it, Jess. This is, believe it or not, this is actually healthy development, right? If I just did this, if a bad guy came in, this is a normal thing. If a bad guy came in, I would do this. And they're like saying things that are absolutely ridiculous and like over the top, and they would go to jail if they did, right? But what they're developing is a sense of hope, will, purpose, and competence, right? And they're building on these things, right? So this is the time when they have the ability to sort of build in mechanism that you send them to school or to be schooled or however you want to school them, because now they can really sort of build upon skills. So they get into puberty, and that's when it all starts to fall apart. And so if these other things are developed, it can be really good. But if they're not, then they're asking a question. Who am I? This is where the emo comes into, right? And you have this identity versus role confusion, where by the end of their pubescence, they know who they are. They're solid in who they are, right? They understand who they are apart from their friends and with their friends. They understand who they are apart from their parents and with their parents, apart from their lovers and with their lovers, right? You want them to develop a good core friendship. And here we have this sense of fidelity, which means it all sort of like comes together here. This is what you want them to develop, this sort of bringing it all together and putting it into something that can eventually be turned into love. Now, what that looks like, 20 to 24, although, again, I would argue that that's probably a lot, like you're looking like 20 to 30, 20 to 35. But what you're looking at here is that they walk out of that time either feeling like they're alone in the world, or they walk out of that time feeling like they just love everybody, right? And they've got their family, they've got their friends, so on and so forth. This is a good time for them to get into relationships. It is not a good time for people to get into relationships when they're in adolescence. It's a good time for them to get into relationships when they're past that, and now they're in their young adulthood, which is, I would argue, 35 maybe, like in this day and age, which is crazy. And that's when they can really start to develop love. Now, what this looks like in the world is a lot of like that messaging of, I'm just done with all the drama. I just want to learn to love myself and like love the people around me. Like that's the stage that they're in. Then you get into middle adulthood, which is much older, I would argue again, and you get into generativity versus stagnation, which is, essentially, am I an industrious person? Am I a person who, works hard and I can feel good about that and I do the projects I want to do? This is when you start seeing people take on like homesteading projects, right? They're like, I want to do this around my house, I want to fix this car, I want to do this thing, and they start collecting, building, all of this stuff, right? And this is a good time for people to take on parenting, right? Because everybody knows that kids are a good project to parent. I'm just kidding. And then it's also the time when people start really thinking, I don't want to work on, this dead-end job, right? I want a career. I want a career path. And here's where you start taking care of others, really thinking about taking care of others. You start really producing content. And then lastly, you have ego integrity versus ego despair, which is essentially, what did I do with my life? Is there something to show for my life? And so a person who doesn't have the compounded things before in the positive has nothing to show. And they despair, and they say, it was all worthless. My children don't love me. I have all these divorces, and I have all of this, and I have debt, and I have all, and so on and so forth, right? Well, 10 to 1, it didn't start there. And then the other side, the person who, is an old person sitting around with all their grandchildren, and they've got, all these friends and people who visit them and take care of them, right? Like, that's a person with ego integrity. And this is the time when you reflect on your life, and this is a time where you are considered wise. So this is Erikson's stages of development. The goal of each developmental level is to complete the ego crisis with the fewest number of what we call residuals. And I'll talk about that in a second. Now, the other thing to note is that we're dealing, believe it or not, on 4 different levels here. So, chronological development is not the same thing as psychological development, is not the same thing as sexual development, is not, the list goes on and on, right? Remember, we talked about cognitive, emotional, body, and something else, can't remember. But we talked about those levels of development that a person is. All of those go through this. Every single one of them. And every time you go through a stage, you're going through all 3 cycles. Does that make sense? It's a lot. It's a lot there. So, basically what happens as human beings, and we've been talking about the ideal, right? I mentioned residuals. We have been talking about the ideal. The truth is not that. That's the ideal. But the truth is that usually people get stuck. They get stuck. Think of it as a ladder where you're trying to get from point A to point B, right? They get stuck in the process of getting from point A to point B at some place. Now, sometimes that can't be helped. Like progress can't be helped sometimes. The most prime example for that would be in terms of the physical. Like a person's body will develop sexually faster than their mind, for instance, right? Believe it or not, there are things which can actually retard the growth of a person's sexuality and physicality, depending on how they're affected cognitively and emotionally. There are things that you might not realize. Like, for instance, have any of you encountered a girl who sounds like a little girl? Like in the regular, like they talk like little girls. You ever seen that or heard that? It's even a trope in like sexual material, like in pornography. It's a trope that a woman like talks like a little girl. You guys ever heard that? Like men like that? That is like generally caused by somebody being sexually stunted when they were young because they were raped. So there's things like that. There's also things that are really strange, like have you ever heard of a man who, okay, yeah. Let me give you this interesting statistic. Most men who are doted on by their mothers tend to exhibit similar signs as men who were molested. It's just a thing. There's ways to affect cognitive, emotional, body development, all sorts of different things. So we want to pay attention to all of them and move them down this path the correct way. So, and when I mean doted on, I don't mean like your mom was nice to you. I mean your mom like did everything for you and called you her little man and called you her world. Like that has an outcome on a child. So our job as parents is to know where a child is stuck and to create proper leadership intervention. Like that's our job as parents. Remember the messaging, I do know what's best for you. I will keep you safe, right? That works all the way through. I mean, hopefully that's what happens in a child-parent relationship even when the parent is old, you know. It's still there. That messaging is still there. So I mentioned, any questions yet? And do you want to add anything?
Lab material.
Yeah. Oh, is that, okay. So I mentioned the concept of residuals. So now we're going to talk about the real world, right? That's the ideal world. The real world, when we're talking about residuals, we have to talk about something called maladaptation. So basically, when attachment cycles are not fulfilled, a person develops a method of making up the difference, right? They make up the stress gaps in between being of, say, an emotional age and a chronological age. Yes?
Just to clarify, the residuals you're talking about is within the ego crisis.
So yeah, so basically, the goal of each developmental level is to complete the ego crisis with the fewest residuals possible. So residuals are things that are left over, right? So they're things left to do. So essentially, yeah, so that's what we're talking about is how we deal with that. So when we come across things that are left to do, but we're still moving forward, then we have to make up the difference. So those gaps are where we make up the difference. And so methods are developed within a maladjusted residual, which is the space between development and the gaps of chronology, basically. So you've grown up. You know, a person is 13. They're entering pubescence, but they never developed. Can you throw up the stages there?
Go back one.
Go back to Erickson's stages. There you go. They never developed trust, so now they have a mistrust of the world. They never developed autonomy. Instead, they have shame and doubt whenever they try to do something. They never try to do anything. They just feel guilty about it. And because of that, they have an inferiority complex, right? And so now you get to pubescence, and you are developed sexually, you're developed in your body, you're developed in these ways, but emotionally, cognitively, so on and so forth, you're not, right? So how do you operate in a world where you're supposed to operate that way, where everybody else is operating that way, but you're not because you haven't developed those skills? Well, what you do is you build a coping mechanism. You put something in place that allows you to operate not as a savage, because the rest of the world is now civilized. And that's how you do that. So you make up the stress gaps in between the emotional age and the chronological age or whatever. So the problem is that these coping mechanisms, if they're left alone, turn into what we call maladaptive behaviors. So we don't want maladjusted residuals, because residuals are gaps that a person has to bridge. Imagine that you've got a hole in the ground, and and you're standing over that hole, right? And then weight gets given to you. And so now you're standing over that hole, and now weight is given to you, and you're holding on to this big thing. So now you're like, well, maybe if I just hold on to it with one hand and put my hand on the ground over here, right? And now another weight gets given to you. And another weight gets given to you. And another weight gets given to you. What happens to you? You fall in the hole, the first hole. So residuals can happen at every stage of development. So we want to close the residuals every single time. So if those residuals are left alone and the coping mechanisms that come out of the residuals are allowed to grow, then essentially what happens is they turn into maladaptive behaviors. So basically, a maladaptive behavior is next one. There you go. Is a societally inappropriate behavior that occurs when the cognitive demands, tasks, demands, expectations being placed on a person exceeds the person's capacity to respond adaptively within societal norms. So essentially what that means is that adaptation is what we want. We want a person to be able to pivot, right? We want a person to be able to deal with things, to cope emotionally, cognitively, so on and so forth, because they have a sense of initiative, they have a sense of hope, they have a sense of will, so on and so forth. All of these things that are supposed to be built. We want them to be able to do that. And so adaptation is something that we prize. Well, when this happens, when residuals are left in place, a person can't adapt anymore and they just crumble underneath it. And so they develop things that will allow them to cope, but they can only cope so far. And generally, when maladjusted residuals grow into maladaptive behaviors and maladaptive behaviors come in contact with societal norms, then one of them wins out, and it's generally not the person. Generally, society takes a person with a maladaptive behavior and puts them in jail, right? Or kills them. So a good example of this would be somebody, can you go back to ego? There you go. Okay, I'll walk you through it. Trust versus mistrust, right? A person has a residual left over because their parent didn't care for them, right? Their parent didn't enable that. When they start to move, their parent doesn't give them proper praise and doesn't set boundaries, right? So then when they get to initiative versus guilt, and let me add to it, the only time their parent does interact with them is when they do something wrong, right? So then when they get to initiative versus guilt, what happens is the parent is straight up yelling at them and doesn't want them to bother them because they're doing their own thing and they're like, go away. So the child says, it's not worth it for me to do anything, right? To get my parents' attention. And the only type of attention I ever get is bad attention. But you know what? You still want your parents' attention, like I said. Why? Because bonding is physiological. So we're still going to try for it. So by the time we get to industry versus inferiority, the child is doing all sorts of things, just not good things. All sorts of things to get their parents' attention because they want it. And they're getting into big trouble now. Well, maybe they're not getting into big trouble. They're getting into little trouble now, going off, maybe stealing a few things, whatever, like when they're in school, getting into fights, so on and so forth, because guess what? That's the only way to get their parents' attention, right? Now, when they go into adolescence, let's say that they have a parent swap, for instance, where it's not like son and father, but son and mother. Their mother's not giving them attention. Well, you know what they're going to do? They're going to look for the attention of their mother in a partner that reminds them of their mother. This list goes on and on and on and on, right? It's a developmental thing. Now, their wife is not giving them the attention that their mother couldn't. Why? Because she's not their mother, right? And so now that they have a sense of, because they're strong enough to exert their will over them, and they've got this combined effort of doing negative things over time, those things escalate because that's the nature of things. They escalate. And so now they're doing things to get their wife's attention that is inappropriate. Maybe they're straight up beating them. Maybe they're doing big crimes to get that attention. But the point being is, it's not a far leap to put that person in jail. Why? Because mom or dad didn't pay attention to them when they were young. Specifically, and that sounds really trite to say, and there's many variables and factors in there, but specifically, mom or dad messaged them something inappropriate, right? The world is something you can't trust. Take it into your own hands because you can't trust the boundaries of things. You will never be in a relationship with somebody. You will never be, and the list goes on, right? You can't have my attention unless. When I'm counseling sexual abuse, what we're dealing with constantly is messaging like that. Like messaging of, this is the only way you'll ever get attention. This is the only way you'll ever have value, so on and so forth. These are areas of extreme exploit. So when we're dealing with, residuals are areas of extreme exploit, where somebody can come in and they can say, you know what, you're having a hard time holding that weight? I can help you. That's what happens, right? And then they become what's called dependent on that person. We can get into that more, but let's keep going. By understanding maladaptions, we as parents can tailor our leadership styles to set up those and care for success. So we need to understand why someone is refusing to follow us. Now we're going to get into actual parenting. We need to understand why somebody is refusing to follow us. Is it because they can't or they won't? This is an important question that we should ask. Is it because they can't or they won't? And so now we're going to deal with leadership styles in how we deal with parenting. So that basically sums up development and sets us up for being able to talk about that. Just to summarize development, I just want to say that maladaptive residuals are generally formed in the area of trust of control. So basically where a parent says, I love my child so much, I could never put this boundary on them. Does that make sense? That's generally where maladaptive residuals begin to form, because a parent thinks they're making their children unsafe, when in actuality, them not giving boundaries is what's making their children unsafe. Because then the child says, well, I have to set my own boundaries. Except the child's not capable of setting their own boundaries because they don't understand the world. So if I can give like one quick piece of advice, it is set proper boundaries that are maintainable. Now we get into leadership styles, because leadership style is all about maintaining trust of control. It's saying, I do know what's best for you, and here's how. And there's ways to do that.
So what I would add is that what you need to understand in childhood development is that up until about the age, from 0 until about probably 6 or 7, children think in the concrete. Mm-hmm. So the reason why you're setting the boundaries is because children don't have the mental capacity to take in all of the abstract factors that have to be factored in for safety and making decisions.
They can't adapt.
They can't adapt.
Mm-hmm.
So they think in concrete. So we'll discuss a little bit later when we begin to flesh this out. But what you'll begin to see is that as your small children, you're the one that has to set the boundaries, because you're the one that understands the complexities of things to know what is a safe boundary. A child cannot set their own boundaries until they begin to intellectually be able to adapt to the abstract nature of life as it's around us. And even then, your job as a parent is to guide them in the process of learning how to do that.
Yeah, and we haven't touched on it. I mean, I'll give you a very brief example of this, and you can research it for yourself. But this is consistent with how the human brain actually works, right? You ever notice that teenagers are stupid? Like, they just kind of are. Well, there's a reason for that, okay? There's a reason for that, because developmentally speaking, physiologically, when a child is in the early stages of development, their brain is separated, right? It's all separate parts, and then it comes together, it gets fused together over time, right? Well, what's happening in a teenager's body physiologically is specifically that the amygdala is separating from it's learning how to stand, essentially. It's the part of your body that regulates things like arousal. So basically, when the amygdala is stimulated, it's like standing erect. And what's happening is it's separating from the rest of the brain in that way, much like the brain of a toddler. So essentially, what you have is teenagers running around like little toddlers. Why is that? Because their brains are operating very similar to each other. In the same vein, when you have somebody who's like 25 and now you can like kind of trust them more, certainly our car insurance rates seem to indicate that, right? Well, there's a reason for that. Physiologically, what's happening is a process called melanization, where the brain is being flushed over with a chemical that hardens the brain. You're no longer capable of forming paths, forming neural pathways of information so easily. When you're young, you can carve these things out really quickly. But when you're older, your brain starts to harden, and now you have to work really hard to make new concepts, right? That is physically happening inside the brain of somebody who is exiting adolescence. So it's not just philosophical. It's actually physiologically. We're talking about things physiologically, and it's important to understand, like, when an adolescent is freaking out, it's important when we're parenting them, and this is my field of expertise specifically, is dealing with young adolescent girls. It's important when you're parenting them to remember sometimes that 16-year-old girl that's freaking out is a 16-year-old girl. And that's what 16-year-old girls do, not because they're emotionally weak, but because that's how brains work. Does that make sense? And boys, when they're aggressive at that age, because that's how brains work. So it's just really important to understand all of these factors when we're talking. We need to understand who we're talking to on all levels, physically, emotionally, cognitively, and that fourth one I can't remember. So yeah, and we should adapt our styles for that. So basically, there's a couple of leadership styles, and we'll go over them quickly. The first leadership style is the overly rigid leader that deals with trust of control by being overly rigid. Then there's the overly permissive leader, and then there's the unpredictable leader. So I don't know if you want to, I know that you like this area better, if you want to kind of go down it.
Well, the simplest way to understand this is that when your child is young, you understanding trust of control, you're setting the parameters. So you tell them what to do.
You want to drop to the next slide?
You tell them what to do because you know what's best for them. And if they get into trouble, they step outside of those parameters, what do? You rescue them. So you are a drill sergeant. You tell them what to do. They don't have to think. If you've been in the military, the whole concept of the military tearing somebody down, the drill sergeant tearing somebody down, is that they're not supposed to think. They're supposed to do what they're told without thinking. That's what you're dealing with when you have a small child. So when I set the parameter that I don't want my child to run out into the street, and I set the parameter that you can't go no further than this, and I enforce that parameter, I don't want my child, when they start to run out into the street, I don't want them to stand there and debate with me whether they should go in or out of the street.
Yeah, as the car's like coming, like.
As the car's coming, because if they debate with me, they're likely to be dead. So as a drill sergeant, I tell them what I want them to do. If they get in trouble, I swoop in and I fix it and I rescue them, because my job is to keep them safe. As they grow older and they begin to develop cognitively, they begin to develop an understanding of who they are, self and what have you. As they start to do this, you can no longer be a drill sergeant for them. You can no longer tell them what they have to do. You have to guide them through the process of being able to make choices for themselves. You cannot be a rescuer. One of the hardest things for parents, you cannot rescue your children. You have to allow them to suffer consequence of choice. This is your choice. This is the consequence. You must suffer the consequence, because that helps them to develop the ability to make decisions and to understand how to make positive choices rather than counterproductive choices. So the drill sergeant, this is many parents have difficulty with this because they've been telling their children, since they were born, that you do this, you do that, you do this, and then
They don't let it go.
they don't let it go. And it also causes a lot of tension for preteens and for teens because they are trying to develop cognitively, they're trying to assert and understand who they are in themselves. And if their parents is constantly telling them what they can and can't do, that's a problem.
Yeah, okay, so what Pastor Monty is alluding to there is that there's three sort of ways that people lean when they're parenting. And it's important for us to not lean so far in a direction that we lose the proper messaging. These are tools for us, right? So there's a right time to be a drill sergeant. Right. There's a right time to be a helicopter. Or nowadays, the term is lawnmower or snowplow. I don't know if you guys have heard those.
Snowplows deal with snowflakes.
Well, snowplows are the reason they're snowflakes, which seems the opposite. But the idea is that there's times that we lean into things other than other times, and we need to be careful about them because we risk undermining the original messaging. That's the difficulty. So with a drill sergeant, it's not that you shouldn't set boundaries. You absolutely should. And sometimes no must happen quickly, must not be questioned in the moment, right? It's very important for the safety for that to happen, especially, as Pastor Monty is saying, when they are super young. Because they're not capable of understanding those things. And just like we can talk, it is the bane of my ministry when I have to deal with the, I'm going to be sloppy here and say the hippie mentality of parenting that says that, my child is this most precious thing ever and is capable of all of these, and I need to respect their personhood when they're young, and I need to give them more respect than that. And when I'm telling a child directly something, and it's like, you don't respect their personhood. You don't respect how they operate. When I'm talking to a child directly and I'm setting clear boundaries for them, I am respecting the childishness of the child, right? I understand how they work, and I'm talking to them the way that they work. You want me to talk to them like they're an adult with an evolved understanding of self, and they're not. That's disrespectful. That's you disrespecting. Anyway, it's my own beef. In any case, you risk messaging certain things when you lean too far in or you don't pivot along the cycles of development, the cycles of trust in the stage of development. So with a drill sergeant, what you risk is undoing the messaging by saying you can't think, by saying that I have to do your thinking for you, right? You are not allowed to think for yourself, soldier, right? I have to do your thinking for you, and that you aren't capable of making it without me. On the other side, you risk messaging that you are too fragile, that you can't make it without me. I always have to come in and save the day for you. There's nothing you can do without me having to be there. You guys ever watch The Goldbergs? There's this show called The Goldbergs where the mom is just ridiculous. She gets a job in the school. She's there at the beck and call of the child. She makes any food they want. It's crazy. She's smothered. A smother. You need me to run interference. You need me to protect you. Basically the message there is you can't make it in life without me. That's the same message, right? You can't make it in life without me, whether it's the drill sergeant or the helicopter parent. If you're wondering about the snowplow, it's I move everything out of the way for you. That's what that means. Sure. And it's been coined because of the concept of snowflakes, which is the generation that Dylan's in, where it's everything has to be done for them. And so you move everything out of the way for them. That's where snowplow has come. In the past, it's been lawnmower, lawnmower parents is what they've said. Anyway, we all will struggle with it at different points in time. And we all struggle with it in different ways out of a sincere love for our children. So if a parent or a co-parent is having that issue, do not assume that that parent does not want what's best for the child, right? That's not what we assume. We assume that they want what's best, but they need some help. They need some help in getting there. Ultimately, what we want is to become what we call consultants. So consultants are leaders who are always there to give advice, but they let the person make the decision. They enable the process of making the decision on their own, with the idea that they'll let the person make as many mistakes as possible when the price tag is affordable. The more mistakes you make, the more you learn.
Yeah, so let me just throw in that our society frowns upon mistakes. That we're told by society all around us that you're not supposed to make a mistake, and it's looked down upon. We only highlight people that are successful, but that puts up a false impression of how it is that we learn to begin with. You learn by making mistakes. Nobody does anything right perfectly the first time. So you have to go back and you have to learn from what you did and see how to improve upon it and try it again. You know, the illustration is, Edison. Edison didn't invent the light bulb the first time he tried it. It's like some 1,500 times before he finally came up with the right methodology that would make it to work. So when you're helping a child develop, part of the process of a consultant is to say, what is the problem? What are some solutions? What do you think about this? How are you going to, and then guide them through the process, allowing them to make choices and then evaluate whether that choice was productive or not and adjust accordingly. That's how we all do it. So, personally, I always say, maybe I'll digress, but I always say that for me, problem solving is a very simple formula. It's where am I now? Where do I want to be? How do I get there? Those are the three questions that you have to ask when you're problem solving. And learning, so teaching your child to begin that process and letting them suffer the consequence of making a poor choice. We're not talking about putting somebody in danger, but we're giving guidance. And part of the issue is the communication with your child so that your child will want to talk to you about this process and want to be there so that you can give that guidance. But if you throw up roadblocks, well, they're just gonna, they're gonna find advice from their friends or their peers, or who knows.
Yeah, they're going to build residuals, right? They're going to have residuals and then build mechanisms within those gaps. And that's going to be fine for that time, but when they move to the next time, it's not going to be fine, and it's going to cause, maladjustment.
Yeah, so mistakes are a good thing, not a bad thing.
When the price tag is low enough. And that's when the price tag is too high, that's when you fly in as the helicopter, right? When you're like,
well, yeah, that's when
go
you
ahead
say,
and cook those eggs, honey,
but,
and then
but
they want to
hopefully,
use their hand.
But hopefully you're going to be aware enough of where your child's at and communicating with them enough so that you know how to address those types of things. When my kids were growing up, he tells me it never happened, but when my kids were growing up, my kids used to say, I'm going to do this. And I would say, well, have you thought that through? Do you think that that's a good decision? Ask yourself those questions before you do something. Because if you wind up in jail, you'll stay there. They're like, oh, come on, Dad. You're a teddy bear. So try me. Find out. So
I've had that conversation with a couple of the girls that I've raised where they've said they're going to make some interesting life choices and what would I do if they ended up in jail? And I said, well, I'd laugh. I'd visit you and I'd laugh. I mean, depending on what it is. I mean,
Yeah.
if you kill somebody, but if you end up in jail for like, a Dewey or something like that, for possession, for an MIP or something like that, no, I'm not going to bail you out. You can stay in jail and, I'll come visit you and tell them that I'm not going to take you home and then I'm going to laugh about it. What?
I have no idea what any of the words you were just saying.
MIP is minor in possession. A Dewey is driver under the influence.
Okay.
Um,
Oh, a DUI. Okay.
Yeah. But, it's important that we teach our children that the consequences of their behavior are the consequences of their choices, right? And so becoming a consultant is your choice to message them that their choices are valuable. And this is very important, that it is important for them to do their own thinking, because the quality of their life has everything to do, well, not everything, but a lot to do with their decisions. You want to teach them to make the right decisions. The best way that you can do this is by messaging, so the message that you give them, and by taking good care of yourselves. Right? You take good care of yourself in front of your child, and what are you doing? You're modeling the behavior and the skill sets that they can then use to become the full person that they are, because quite honestly, there's very little of language that is just words. You are sending a huge amount of messaging through the way you behave. It's important that you as a consultant work to never take an opportunity away from your child to learn how to grow as a person, and to give them as many opportunities to fail and succeed as you can while the price tag is low. One of the things we talk about in foster care is better for you to cry when they're better for them to cry when they're 2 than for you to cry when they're 20.
Mm-hmm.
So then it's really important that you understand what kind of leader you are. And it's important that you spend your time as a parent identifying with your child what their choices are. So instead of taking the problem from them, unless it's an issue of danger, like immediate, imminent danger, allow them to solve their situations. Don't take the problem from them. And that goes across all ages. It is as simple as you want your child to learn to crawl, stop moving the object that you put in front of them toward them. If you move it toward them, they're not going to learn to crawl. Instead, what are they going to learn? When I want something, mom and dad give it to me. When you do that, you are messaging them something. You are teaching them that their initiative doesn't apply. That's a problem. It's not a problem visibly now, but it's a problem when they get older, because they're going to have to deal with residuals in order to make it. What happens when they get into a point in school where you're not doing their homework for them anymore? Right? Because lots of parents do that. Oh, it's too hard, just let me do it. Or I want my child to look a certain way, so I'm going to just do a little bit of fancy editing here. You get to a certain point, it's like that child has now, they're living in a picture of their mother and father. It's inappropriate. And a child is not going to be able to get to where they're at. And that starts at a very young age. So you need to teach your children how to identify the problem. Is it your problem? A lot of things in your life, in parenting, are not your problem.
I tried helping you guys do your math. And, you asked me, Dad, please don't ever do that again.
A lot of things are not your problem as parents. It is your opportunity to teach your child how to solve their own problem. And so often, because we care for our children and because we're exhausted, we're just like, oh, just give it here. Let me do it for you. Yeah, I'll just help you with this, because you don't want to wait the extra 10, 15 minutes to watch your child dilly-dally and do all the things that they're going to do and get distracted 20 times while you sent them on a simple task. You're like, I'll just do it myself. right? You can't do that. You do that, and it teaches the child basically the wrong thing about the world, which seems benign now, but grows into something cancerous and toxic later. You have to let people solve their own problems so that they can learn from them.
Learn from them and take responsibility
Yes.
for them in correcting what needs to be corrected so that it's productive rather than counterproductive. All you have to do is turn on the news today and listen time and time again to people who are now in their adulthood stage that will not accept responsibility for their actions. Somebody else is always responsible because they won't accept responsibility. You need to teach your child actions are consequence. You take the action, you suffer consequence.
Or get gains.
Yeah. That's your choice.
Well, and it creates, it's applicable everywhere. It's applicable when your marriage is dying because marriage is work. It's applicable in your job performance. I'll tell you, as a manager, because I managed outside of this place, I managed for about 15 years. And as a manager, one of the things that I constantly said to my employees is, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. Mm-hmm. Like, I get this is a problem to you. That's your problem. I'm the manager, so I don't have that problem. Like, I have you, so you can have that problem. So bring me solutions. And there's something that's similar, like any employee who then starts thinking about it, and they're like, yeah, what is my solution to that? And they start taking initiative that way. That's a person who gets promoted to management. Like, that's what a manager is. You want your child to succeed? Have them think. We have this slightly, now I'm looking at it, it might be slightly inappropriate, but we're going to do it anyway. Let's go to the fortune cookie one. There you go. A child who knows his problems are the concerns of another concerns himself with none of his problems. I say it might just be inappropriate because it seems culturally insensitive, even though fortune cookies aren't actually Asian, and I'm actually Asian, so I think it's okay. Anyway, so who should be worrying, okay? A child is going to say this, as we all would, right? A child is going to say this, my mom or dad has this problem well in hand, so why should we both be worrying about it? That's what a child's going to say, if you give them the wrong messaging. So even when a child doesn't seem concerned about his problems, parents should stay out of the problem so that the child can learn to deal with them. Otherwise, we're not creating a space where the child can cultivate solutions. They're not able to pivot. So when you see your child having issues, like, stay out unless it is an issue of safety. Does that make sense? Not because you don't care, but because you care. You want to give them the opportunities to solve it. And you can encourage their solutions. You can be like, there's ways to do it. You can be like, hey, what are you doing? What are you planning on doing to fix that? You know, like, what are some ideas you have right now? Let's talk them through. There are ways you can enable it. When I say stay out, I mean don't solve the problem.
And don't, because your child is doing something different than you would do.
Yeah, super important.
That doesn't mean that it's wrong.
Well, here's...
Allow for your child's creativity and that they may approach it differently, and allow them space to be able to develop that.
Well, here's where the beauty in parenting really comes in, which is that as human beings, we're capable of learning from our children at this point. You know, they're going to solve things in ways you would never think to solve them. You know, so there's something really beautiful about that. But if you are solving them for them, or being like, no, this is the only way you can do it, like being super rigid, it's like, that's a problem. That is detrimental to the child. So we have to be careful about showing them, this is how I do it, and teaching them your method as your method, like that's one thing. That doesn't go too far. 2, this is the only way to do it, and this is how you will do it. And if you don't do it this way, then you are wrong. Practically speaking, like, I don't have a problem for like holding a pencil, okay? This is a thing I have. I'm an artist, if you guys don't know, and I have a thing about holding pencils. My children hold pencils like this. This is not how you hold a pencil, okay? Because you only have or like this, anything like this. You don't hold a pencil like this because this only gives you 1 point of articulation. You hold a pencil like this because this gives you 1 point and 2 points of articulation. Okay? There's reason to this. For the longest time, my children would not hold a pencil that way. They just told me, Dad, this feels more comfortable, so on and so forth. So, I'm going to tell them, this is how I hold a pencil, this is why I believe you should hold a pencil this way, and this is what will enable you for success. Watch me succeed, and you see if you can do that. For so long, they wouldn't hold a pencil that way. And then as their drawings became more complex, they learned the other way was better, right? I did not shame them for holding a pencil incorrectly. Because why? Because their life is not dependent on how they hold a pencil. See? Now, if they're playing with a knife, I might feel differently about that. If they're playing with a gun, I might feel differently about that. But with a pencil, this is not an issue. If they want to look that way, that's their problem.
Real quick.
Yeah.
That reminds me of Joseph and him wearing the shoes on the wrong feet all the time. I love that.
I hate it.
I know. I always point it out to him when he's like, look, man, give me my space.
Yeah.
This is what I'm doing. I'm like, oh.
Yeah. For those of you who haven't paid attention to it, Joseph constantly puts his shoes on the wrong way. And I'll give you another example that he does. He likes to put on his underwear backwards as well.
He's going to be so mad you told us that.
And the thing is, no, he's all about it.
Yeah, he's like,
The thing is that this is not a life or death situation. He is not in any danger here. And even though that is not the correct way to wear it, just definitively, like they didn't construct it that way, it's not made for that purpose, it's okay. It's okay. And if one day he wants to, if God forbid he waits for, God forbid he doesn't wait for marriage, and one day he reveals to his wife that his underwear is on backwards, and she looks at him and says, "You are stupid." That's on him. That's not on me. And you know what? He'll be safe. That's the thing. He has the ability to develop that his own way. And it applies in things that are small like that. And his life will be better, when his shoes are on correctly. Like that's the case. And he'll learn from that. And one day we were on a walk and his shoes were hurting him. And I said to him, "Why do you think your shoes are hurting you that way, Joseph?" And he's like, "Because they're not on correctly." And I was like, "Well, do you want to keep walking that way or do you want to fix it? What do you want to do?" And he was like, "Well, I guess we can fix it this time." And I was like, "I'll take the win."
I would just wish to point out, Josh, that
Oh boy, here we go.
if he learns to take responsibility for his actions, then that may well be the discussion he has with his would-be wife. However, if she says to him, "Is that how your father taught you to put your underwear on?" and he doesn't take responsibility, you will be the villain.
Right. No, I've been very clear with him. All right, so we are going to, I think we're going to stop here. Actually, we're only about halfway through. We're gonna stop here. I have 2 class times scheduled for this, so we're gonna stop here and continue on during the next class of it. But I want to just break for workshop to Q&A, anything, because we're real close to, we're only 10 minutes out from our noon time. So we're going to stop at conventional versus unconventional wisdom. That's where we'll pick up the next time. We can stop the feed too, and we'll call that part 1, so that we're not on.